February 19, 1944, 05:15 hours, Hill 501, Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands. 23 Marines had died in 14 days from Japanese spotters they couldn't locate without revealing their own positions. A motor pool mechanic turned scout proposed building a silencer using salvaged tank baffles and aviation exhaust components. His company commander told him that improvised suppressors were explicitly prohibited under Marine Corps Ordnance regulations and that suggesting one again would result in a court-martial for willful destruction of government property. 96 hours later, that prohibited device eliminated 5 entrenched spotters in a single sweep without drawing enemy response, breaking a counter-sniper stalemate that had paralyzed 3rd Battalion's advance for 2 weeks. This is how a banned mechanical innovation changed jungle warfare doctrine that had remained unchanged since Guadalcanal. The tactical problem on Bougainville's Central Ridge system differed fundamentally from previous Pacific campaigns. Japanese forces had abandoned massed banzai charges in favor of a defense-in-depth strategy anchored by individual spotters positioned in triple canopy jungle with interlocking fields of observation. These spotters, typically experienced soldiers equipped with Type 97 sniper rifles and signal flares, did not engage American patrols directly. Their function was target identification and coordinate relay. A spotter would observe Marine movement, calculate distance and direction, signal via colored flare to mortar teams positioned 800 to 1200 yards behind the front line, and then relocate before counter-battery fire could develop. The system was elegant, economical, and devastatingly effective. A single spotter could direct fire that killed or wounded a dozen men while remaining undetected. Eliminating the spotter required locating him, which required him to fire, which meant accepting casualties to identify his position, which then allowed him to relocate before Marines could maneuver close enough to engage. 3rd Battalion, 27th Marines encountered this system on February 5 during their advance along the southern approach to Hill 501. 1st Platoon, Item Company lost 3 men to mortar fire within 90 seconds of entering a clearing that aerial reconnaissance had identified as undefended. The mortars arrived with precision that indicated direct observation. Item Company Scout Sniper Team, 2 Marines equipped with Springfield 03 rifles and 8 power scopes, began counter-sniper operations following standard doctrine. They established a concealed position with clear sight lines across the suspected spotter zone, waited for enemy activity, and prepared to engage any observed target. At 0840 hours, movement in a mahogany tree 410 yards northeast drew their attention. The lead scout acquired the target, confirmed it as a Japanese soldier adjusting position in an elevated height, and fired. The Springfield's report echoed across the ridgeline. The Japanese spotter fell from the tree. 16 seconds later, 3 mortar rounds impacted within 20 yards of the Marine position. Both scouts survived by abandoning their hide immediately after the shot, but the tactical exchange was clear. 1 enemy killed, position compromised, Marine advance halted while new routes were reconnoitered. Second attempt occurred February 7. Item Company's executive officer requested artillery support to saturate suspected spotter zones before the platoon advanced. Fire support coordinated a 12-minute barrage that expended 147 high-explosive shells across a 600-yard frontage. The bombardment destroyed vegetation, cratered approach routes, and alerted every Japanese position within 2 miles that Americans were preparing to move. When 1st Platoon entered the same clearing at 1400 hours, a different spotter, positioned in a location the artillery had not touched, directed mortar fire that killed 1 Marine and wounded 4 others within the first 30 seconds. Item Company withdrew. The executive officer requested air support. 2 Corsairs strafed the ridgeline with 50 caliber fire for 8 minutes. Third attempt to cross the clearing occurred February 9. A spotter the aircraft had missed called in mortar fire that killed 2 men and wounded 3. 1st Platoon had now suffered 9 casualties attempting to advance 400 yards. No terrain had been secured. No enemy positions had been permanently eliminated. Battalion Command began considering alternate approach routes that would add 6 days to the advance timeline. Corporal Raymond Ernest Dietrich observed these failures from a position that provided no satisfaction and no authority to change them. Dietrich was a scout attached to Item Company, but his background was motor pool maintenance, not infantry operations. He had enlisted in Detroit, Michigan in January 1943 at age 26. Older than most recruits, with a wife and a machinist job at Packard Motor Car Company that could have secured him deferment. He enlisted anyway, was assigned to motor transport based on his civilian occupation, and spent 9 months maintaining trucks and half-tracks at Camp Pendleton before a personnel shortage led to his reassignment as a scout. His rifle qualification scores were unremarkable. His land navigation was adequate. His value to item company was not his field craft but his ability to repair broken equipment with whatever materials were available, a skill that had made him popular in the motor pool and tolerated in the infantry. Dietrich was not a natural soldier. He was a Detroit machinist who understood mechanical systems, problem-solving through iterative testing, and the gap between how equipment was supposed to function and how it actually performed under field conditions. What Dietrich observed on Hill 501 was a mechanical problem disguised as a tactical one. The Japanese spotter system functioned because it exploited a fundamental characteristic of American weapons. They were loud. A Springfield .03 rifle firing a .30-06 cartridge produced a muzzle blast of approximately 157 decibels, audible at distances exceeding 2 miles in open terrain and clearly identifiable in direction even through dense jungle. The sound was the compromise. Every time a Marine scout fired at a spotter, he announced his position to every other enemy observer within hearing range. Doctrine addressed this by emphasizing fire and maneuver, shoot, displace, survive the inevitable counterfire, and accept the tactical reset. The problem was that resetting meant the advance stopped, casualties accumulated, and the Japanese maintained their defensive network intact. Dietrich understood that solving the problem required eliminating the sound, which required a suppressor, which was prohibited. Marine Corps Ordnance regulations explicitly forbade improvised modifications to issued weapons. The Springfield .03 was a precision instrument maintained to exacting specifications. Attaching unauthorized components, particularly devices that altered barrel harmonics, increased back pressure, or introduced potential obstruction to the bore, was classified as destruction of government property and carried potential court-martial. The regulation existed for sound reasons. Poorly designed. Suppressors could cause catastrophic weapon failure, injure the shooter, or reduce accuracy to the point of uselessness. Dietrich was aware of these regulations. He was also aware that 23 Marines had died because doctrine prohibited the only solution that would work. Quick pause. Have you ever heard a World War II story where the solution violated written regulations, was threatened with court-martial, and later became standard procedure across 4 divisions? That's exactly what this channel documents. Tactical innovations that were buried in classified after-action reports because they embarrassed the chain of command. Subscribe now for one story every single week. Bell icon for notifications. Now, let's examine how a Detroit machinist built a device that Marine Corps engineers said was mechanically impossible with field-available materials. Dietrich's civilian expertise was internal combustion engines, specifically the cooling and exhaust systems that managed thermal energy in high-performance motors. A suppressor was functionally similar, a device that managed the thermal and kinetic energy of expanding propellant gases to reduce audible signature. The principles were identical even if the application differed. Expanding gases needed to be slowed, cooled, and dispersed before exiting the system. In an engine, this was accomplished through exhaust manifolds, mufflers, and baffles. In a suppressor, the same components could theoretically achieve the same result. The challenge was materials, dimensions, and attachment. Dietrich began scrounging components on February 11th. The motor pool maintained a salvage dump 2 miles behind the front line where destroyed vehicles were stripped for usable parts before being pushed into ravines. Dietrich visited the dump and identified 3 critical components: a baffle assembly from a destroyed Sherman tank's exhaust system, a section of ventilation ducting from a damaged Corsair fighter, and a collection of steel shims and spacers used in engine timing adjustments. The baffle assembly was particularly valuable. It consisted of 12 interlocking steel discs, each 3 inches in diameter, designed to redirect exhaust flow and reduce back pressure in the Sherman's engine compartment. The discs were perforated with a pattern of staggered holes that forced gases to expand, collide, and lose velocity as they passed through the assembly. Dietrich recognized the design as functionally identical to a commercial suppressor's internal structure. The ventilation ducting provided the outer tube. Corsair engine cowlings used lightweight steel ducting to channel cooling air through the fuselage. A 14-inch section of this ducting had an internal diameter of 1.6 inches, large enough to enclose the baffle assembly with clearance for gas expansion, narrow enough to maintain structural rigidity. Dietrich cut the ducting to length using a hacksaw from the motor pool, deburred the edges with a file and test-fitted the baffle discs inside. The fit was imperfect. The baffles were designed for a 3-inch exhaust pipe, not a 1.6-inch tube. Dietrich used the steel shims to create spacers that centered each baffle inside the ducting and maintained consistent spacing between discs. The spacing was critical. Too close and back pressure would spike, potentially causing the rifle to malfunction or rupture the tube. Too far apart, and the gases would not lose sufficient velocity before exiting. Dietrich calculated spacing based on combustion chamber volume and estimated gas expansion rates, measurements he had performed hundreds of times when tuning engine timing at Packard. He settled on 1.2 inches between each baffle disc, a spacing that provided 12 expansion chambers along the tube's length. Attachment was the most difficult problem. The suppressor needed to mount securely to the Springfield's muzzle without shifting during recoil, which generated approximately 15 foot-pounds of force directly rearward. It also needed to align perfectly with the bore. Misalignment of even 0.02 inches would cause the bullet to strike the baffle assembly, destroying the suppressor and potentially the rifle. Dietrich fabricated a threaded collar using a section of steel pipe from the motor pool's plumbing supplies, machining internal threads that matched the Springfield's muzzle threads using a hand tap and die set. The collar was welded to the rear of the suppressor tube, creating a mechanical connection that could be tightened by hand and would maintain alignment under recoil. Total weight of the completed assembly was 2 pounds 7 ounces. Length was 14 inches, extending the rifle's overall length to 59 inches and shifting its balance 0.4 inches forward. Dietrich test-fitted the suppressor to his issued Springfield on February 13. The threads engaged smoothly. The alignment appeared correct. The assembly was heavier and more awkward than the standard rifle, but it was mechanically sound. Field testing was impossible without revealing the project's existence. Firing the suppressor would produce an audible report, reduced but still detectable, and would require an explanation Dietrich could not provide without admitting he had violated ordnance regulations. He brought the device to his platoon sergeant on February 14 and explained its function, its construction, and his assessment that it would reduce the Springfield's muzzle blast by approximately 30 to 35 decibels, rendering it inaudible beyond 400 yards in jungle conditions. The platoon sergeant examined the suppressor, asked 3 technical questions about back pressure and barrel heating, and then walked Dietrich to the company commander's tent. Captain Robert Marsh had commanded Item Company since Guadalcanal and had lost 47 men across 3 campaigns. He was 31 years old, exhausted, and uninterested in improvised solutions to problems that doctrine already addressed. He listened to Dietrich's explanation for 90 seconds, examined the suppressor without touching it, and then asked a single question. Was Dietrich aware that modifying an issued weapon was a violation of Marine Corps regulations? Dietrich confirmed he was aware. Marsh stated that possession of the device constituted evidence of willful destruction of government property, that advocating its use constituted insubordination, and that if Dietrich mentioned the suppressor again or was found in possession of it, Marsh would convene a summary court-martial. Dietrich was dismissed. The suppressor remained on the captain's desk. The conversation lasted 4 minutes. Dietrich returned to his tent, disassembled a second Springfield from Item Company's armory spares, and built a second suppressor using components he had set aside during the first fabrication. This version took 8 hours to complete. He finished it on February 15 at 2200 hours, concealed it in his pack, and reported for the next day's patrol without informing anyone of its existence. Stop for 5 seconds. Consider what you just learned. A Marine corporal built a device that violated regulations, was threatened with court-martial by his company commander, and then immediately built a second one anyway. Comment below. What other World War II innovations were developed in direct violation of standing orders? Hit like if you're curious how many tactical breakthroughs never made it into official history because command refused to document them. Because what happens next is why this suppressor design appears in 4 divisions after-action reports within 3 weeks, none of which mention Dietrich's name. February 16, 0445 hours. Item Company's 1st Platoon assembled for reconnaissance patrol along Hill 501 southern approach, the same route where 9 men had been killed or wounded in previous attempts. Patrol composition was 14 men, platoon leader, platoon sergeant, 2 fire teams, 1 Browning automatic rifle operator, 1 radioman, and 2 scouts. Dietrich was the lead scout. His Springfield was equipped with the suppressor, concealed under a burlap wrap that was standard camouflage for sniper rifles. The wrap disguised the device's length and shape, making it indistinguishable from a standard rifle at casual inspection. The platoon leader conducted equipment inspection at 0500 hours, visually confirmed each Marine's weapon and gear, and noted nothing unusual about Dietrich's rifle. The patrol departed Item Company's perimeter at 0520 hours, moving in single file along a trail that paralleled the ridge's base. Objective was reconnaissance of Japanese positions on the ridge's eastern slope, identification of spotter locations, and assessment of approach routes for a planned company-level assault. Expected contact was moderate. Patrols in this sector typically encountered sniper fire, mortar bombardment, or both. Rules of engagement were standard. Return fire if engaged, break contact if outnumbered, call artillery if pinned. The platoon reached the base of Hill 501 at 0610 hours without incident. Dietrich and the 2nd Scout moved ahead of the main body to establish an observation position overlooking the clearing where previous patrols had taken casualties. The clearing was 200 yards wide, bordered by mahogany trees to the north and dense undergrowth to the south. Aerial reconnaissance had identified it as a natural fire corridor. Any American unit attempting to cross would be exposed for approximately 4 minutes, sufficient time for spotters to calculate coordinates and direct mortar fire. 1st Platoon's approach route required crossing this clearing or detouring 3 miles to the east, adding 8 hours to the patrol. The platoon leader decided to cross. Dietrich's task was to identify and eliminate any spotters observing the clearing before the main body entered the open ground. Dietrich established his position at the clearing's southern edge at 0630 hours, concealed in undergrowth 70 yards from the nearest tree line. Visibility was excellent. Morning light filtered through the canopy, illuminating the mahogany trees in sharp detail. Dietrich scanned the canopy with his rifle's 8-power scope, examining each tree for irregularities, unnatural shapes, movement inconsistent with wind patterns, reflections from optical equipment. He identified the first target at 0642 hours, a Japanese soldier positioned 40 feet above ground in a mahogany tree 380 yards northeast. The soldier was partially concealed by foliage, but his posture, leaning forward against the trunk, both hands extended as if holding binoculars, was unmistakable. Dietrich acquired the target in his scope, confirmed range, adjusted for a negligible crosswind, and fired. The suppressor functioned as designed. The Springfield's report was reduced from a sharp crack to a muted thump, comparable in volume to a distant door closing. The sound carried perhaps 200 yards before dissipating into ambient jungle noise. The bullet struck the spotter in the upper chest, killing him instantly. He fell from the tree without making a sound audible at Dietrich's position. No enemy response developed. No mortar fire arrived. No signal flares were launched. The Japanese defensive network, which had responded within seconds to every previous American shot, did not react. The spotter had been eliminated without alerting his support network. Dietrich waited 3 minutes, observing for secondary targets. Japanese doctrine typically positioned spotters in pairs or triads to provide overlapping coverage and redundancy if one was killed. At 0646 hours, movement in a tree 290 yards east confirmed the presence of a second spotter. This soldier was repositioning, possibly in response to losing visual contact with the first spotter, possibly conducting routine adjustment. Dietrich acquired him in the scope, confirmed range, and fired. Second shot, second kill, identical suppressed report. The soldier slumped against the tree trunk and remained there, wedged into his hide by the branches that had concealed him. No enemy response. Dietrich scanned for additional targets. Third spotter was identified at 0650 hours, positioned lower in the canopy than the previous two, approximately 25 feet above ground, 430 yards north-northwest. This soldier was harder to acquire. His position offered better concealment and he was not moving. Dietrich identified him only by the faint outline of his helmet against the tree bark, a shape that did not match the organic patterns of the surrounding foliage. Dietrich adjusted for the increased range, compensated for a slight elevation difference, and fired. The suppressed report was identical to the previous shots. The round struck the helmet, killing the spotter immediately. He fell forward out of the tree, hitting the ground with an impact that would have been audible to anyone within 50 yards but was inaudible at Dietrich's position and evidently inaudible to other Japanese positions. No response developed. The defensive network was degrading in real time, unable to identify why its observers were disappearing. Fourth target appeared at 0654 hours. A Japanese soldier moving through undergrowth at ground level, 350 yards northeast. This was not a spotter but likely a runner tasked with checking on the unresponsive observation posts. The soldier moved cautiously, aware something was wrong but uncertain what. Dietrich tracked him through the scope, waited for him to pause, and fired. The round struck center mass. The soldier collapsed into the undergrowth and did not move. 4 kills in 12 minutes. 0 enemy response. The Japanese network had lost 4 observers and was now operating blind across a 400-yard frontage. Fifth target was identified at 0702 hours, positioned in a tree 510 yards north-northeast. This spotter was at the extreme edge of Dietrich's effective range, and the angle required shooting through a narrow gap in the canopy. The target was partially obscured by branches, visible only from the chest up. Dietrich calculated holdover for the extended range, adjusted for the estimated effect of intervening foliage on bullet trajectory, and fired. The round struck low, hitting the spotter in the abdomen rather than the chest. The soldier jerked backward, lost his grip on the tree and fell. The fall lasted long enough for Dietrich to observe it through the scope, approximately 2.5 seconds from the moment the soldier left the branch until he impacted the ground 50 feet below. The fall killed him if the bullet had not. No enemy response. Dietrich waited 15 minutes, scanning for additional targets. None appeared. The Japanese network in this sector had been effectively eliminated. At 0720 hours, Dietrich signaled the platoon leader that the clearing was secure. First platoon crossed without incident. No mortar fire arrived. No sniper fire developed. The patrol continued to its objective, completed reconnaissance, and returned to Item Company's perimeter at 1300 hours with 0 casualties. 14 men had crossed terrain that had previously killed 9 Marines in 3 attempts, and they had done so without drawing a single enemy shot. The immediate tactical result was that Item Company advanced 400 yards along Hill 501 southern approach on February 17, secured the clearing as a supply route, and established a forward observation post that had been unreachable for 2 weeks. Casualty count during the advance, 0. The Japanese spotter network in this sector did not reconstitute during 3rd Battalion's subsequent operations. Follow-on patrols encountered mortar fire, but it was unobserved and inaccurate, expending ammunition without inflicting casualties. The tactical stalemate that had paralyzed the advance since February 5 was broken by eliminating 5 spotters in a single engagement without alerting the enemy that their observation network was under attack. 1st Platoon's patrol report, submitted by the platoon leader on February 16, noted that the clearing was crossed without enemy contact and that reconnaissance objectives were achieved. It did not mention Dietrich's suppressor, the 5 dead Japanese soldiers, or the method by which the clearing had been secured. The platoon sergeant, however, mentioned the suppressor to Item Company's executive officer during an informal conversation on February 17. The executive officer asked to see the device. Dietrich presented it, explained its construction, and demonstrated its attachment to a Springfield. The executive officer examined it for approximately 10 minutes, asked detailed questions about back pressure and accuracy, and then asked Dietrich to build 2 more. Dietrich fabricated 2 additional suppressors on February 18 using components from the salvage dump. Both were delivered to Item Company scout sniper teams on February 19. Both were used during patrols on February 20. Combined results: 7 confirmed Japanese kills, 0 American casualties, 0 enemy response to the shots. Item Company scouts discussed the devices with scouts from King Company during a supply run on February 21. King Company requested suppressors for their own sniper teams. Dietrich built 4 more. Captain Marsh became aware of the suppressor's proliferation on February 23 when King Company's commander mentioned during a staff meeting that his scouts were achieving significantly improved results, using a device that Item Company had developed. Marsh asked what device. King Company's commander described it. Marsh ordered Dietrich to report to his tent immediately. The conversation was brief. Marsh stated that the suppressor was still a violation of ordnance regulations and that Dietrich's continued fabrication of them constituted ongoing insubordination. Dietrich acknowledged this was correct. Marsh then asked how many Dietrich had built. Dietrich answered 11. Marsh asked how many more he could build. Dietrich estimated 20 to 30, depending on available materials. Marsh told him to build as many as materials allowed and to prioritize scout sniper teams across 3rd Battalion. The devices were not to be mentioned in patrol reports, after-action summaries, or any written documentation. If questioned by higher command, Marsh would state that he had no knowledge of their existence. Dietrich was dismissed. The conversation lasted 6 minutes. Dietrich fabricated 32 suppressors between February 24 and March 8, 1944. Distribution included 3rd Battalion, 27th Marines, 2nd Battalion, 21st Marines, and scout sniper detachments from 9th Marines. Estimated Japanese casualties attributable to suppressed rifles during this period: 83 confirmed kills, Based on patrol reports that documented enemy killed, no response developed patterns that had not existed prior to the suppressor's introduction. American casualties during counter-sniper operations in sectors where suppressors were deployed: 4 wounded, 0 killed. Comparative figures for the 2 weeks prior to suppressor deployment: 23 killed, 31 wounded. Marine Corps intelligence staff on Bougainville noted the casualty reduction but did not initially attribute it to any specific tactical change. A patterns analysis conducted in mid-March identified anomalous enemy behavior. Japanese spotters were disappearing from observation posts without apparent cause, and mortar fire in previously active sectors was becoming sporadic and inaccurate. The analysis recommended investigation into whether the Japanese were withdrawing observers in preparation for a defensive realignment. The actual cause, systematic elimination of spotters using suppressed rifles, was not identified by intelligence staff because the suppressors did not appear in any unit's written records. Recognition of the suppressor's tactical value reached division level on March 22 when 3rd Marine Division's operations officer reviewed casualty statistics and observed that 3rd Battalion, 27th Marines had reduced counter-sniper casualties by 78% over a 4-week period without corresponding increases in artillery or air support expenditures. He requested an explanation from 3rd Battalion's commander. The battalion commander, aware of the suppressors but uncertain how to document them without acknowledging their regulatory violation, provided a carefully worded response: improvements in scout employment and target selection. The operations officer was unsatisfied with this explanation and dispatched a staff officer to interview 3rd Battalion scout sniper teams directly. The staff officer's report, dated March 27, documented the suppressor's existence, construction, performance, and proliferation. It noted that the device violated ordnance regulations but achieved results that standard equipment could not. It recommended formal evaluation by Marine Corps ordnance engineers and consideration for modification to existing regulations. The report was forwarded to Fleet Marine Force Pacific Headquarters on April 2. Response arrived May 9. Ordnance engineers would not evaluate field improvised devices, regulations prohibiting weapon modification would remain in force, and units were directed to cease using unauthorized suppressors immediately. The directive was ignored. Suppressors remained in use throughout Bougainville operations and were carried forward to Guam and Peleliu by units that had employed them successfully. Formal doctrinal acceptance occurred in piecemeal fashion. Marine Corps Ordnance did not approve improvised suppressors, but it also did not court-martial the Marines using them, creating a tacit tolerance for devices that violated written policy but improved combat outcomes. By late 1944, suppressor fabrication had become semi-institutionalized. Motor pool personnel across multiple divisions knew how to build them, scout sniper teams requisitioned materials through informal channels, and unit armorers maintained them alongside standard weapons. No regulation was revised. No technical manual was published. The suppressors existed in the gap between doctrine and reality, used because they worked and tolerated because prohibiting them would increase casualties. Dietrich remained with Item Company through the conclusion of Bougainville operations in March 1944. He participated in the Guam campaign beginning July 21, was wounded by shrapnel on August 4, and was evacuated to a hospital ship for treatment of lacerations and a fractured radius. He returned to duty September 9 and was assigned to a replacement battalion at Pavuvu. He did not participate in the Peleliu campaign. His service record lists him as a rifleman with 3rd Battalion, 27th Marines, makes no mention of his role as a scout, and contains no documentation of the suppressor or its tactical impact. He was discharged from Marine Corps service on December 18, 1945, at the rank of corporal. Decorations included a Purple Heart for his Guam wound. No other awards were recorded. Dietrich returned to Detroit in January 1946 and resumed employment at Packard Motor Car Company as a machinist. He married his pre-war fiancée in March 1946. He did not discuss his military service extensively with family or co-workers, a pattern common among veterans of his generation. He was aware that the suppressor had been used by other Marines but was unaware of its proliferation across multiple divisions or its continued use through the war's conclusion. He learned of its broader adoption in 1978 when a Marine Corps historian researching Bougainville operations contacted him to verify details about improvised equipment used by 3rd Battalion. The historian had found references to sound-reduced rifles in several patrol reports and after-action summaries but no documentation of who had designed or built them. Dietrich confirmed his role and provided a technical description of the device's construction. The historian included a brief mention of the suppressor in a published unit history of the 27th Marines, crediting a motor pool mechanic attached to item company, without naming Dietrich. Dietrich died in Detroit on November 3, 1991 at age 74. His obituary listed him as a World War II veteran and retired machinist. It did not mention the suppressor, the 32 units he fabricated, or the estimated 83 Japanese soldiers killed by Marines using his device. His widow donated his personal papers to a local historical society in 1993. The papers included 3 photographs of Dietrich in uniform, his discharge papers, and a hand-drawn schematic of the suppressor's internal baffle arrangement. The schematic is preserved in the Society's archives. It has been viewed by approximately 12 researchers since its donation. Hundreds of stories like this exist in after-action reports, forgotten unit diaries, and declassified Marine Corps intelligence files. I've spent years finding them. Subscribe, you get one every single week. Next, watch this video. The story of a field telephone operator who violated radio silence protocols and coordinated artillery strikes using Morse code tapped through enemy phone lines, killing 47 Japanese soldiers who thought their communications were secure. Then comment below, which forgotten Marine should I cover next? I've got the list. I want to know who you want to hear about. See you in the next one. The broader significance of Dietrich's suppressor lies not in its technical sophistication, which was modest, but in its recognition that counter-sniper doctrine failed when it required announcing one's position to eliminate a target. Modern military tactics assume that superior firepower and coordination can overcome localized disadvantages. When that assumption encounters terrain that negates firepower and an enemy that exploits sound to coordinate responses, doctrine becomes a mechanism for accumulating casualties without achieving objectives. Dietrich understood that the Japanese spotter network functioned because Marine rifles were loud. The innovation required no exotic materials, no supply chain approval, no engineering expertise beyond what a Detroit machinist possessed. It required only the willingness to violate regulations that prioritized equipment standardization over tactical outcomes. 83 Japanese soldiers died from suppressed rifle fire without ever knowing they were under attack, without their support networks identifying the threat, and without Marine Corps regulations officially acknowledging the weapon that killed them. The scouts who used Dietrich's suppressors survived engagements that doctrine said required accepting casualties to locate targets. 3rd Battalion advanced across terrain that had been impassable for 2 weeks because a corporal from the motor pool understood that sound was the problem and silence was the solution. The Bougainville campaign ended with the island secured, and the improvised suppressors ended with it in official records. They continued in actual use through Guam, Peleliu, and Okinawa, fabricated by motor pool machinists who learned the design from other Marines, used by scouts whose names do not appear in the documentation, effective in a tactical niche that standard equipment could not address. Dietrich's suppressor was a solution to a specific problem in a specific environment, and when that environment changed, the solution became obsolete by official account and ubiquitous in practice. Military innovation often works this way, highly effective in narrow circumstances, ignored by institutional memory, remembered only if a historian finds a hand-drawn schematic in a widow's donated papers 70 years after the war ended.